justice by bringing together students, scholars, activists, policymakers, and members of communities, people just like you. We discuss a wide range of issues affecting Oregon, our nation, and the world. We work in the tradition of Oregon Senator Wayne Morse, who believed that political independence and education were the building blocks of justice and democracy. This event, as you can see, is part of the Center's program titled Making Work, Work, a theme that we began last fall 2021, and that will continue through spring 2023. We pride ourselves on being very timely with our themes, and I hope you'll agree that this pandemic and perhaps post-pandemic moment presents the greatest opportunity we've had, perhaps in many decades, to intervene boldly in debates about what the future of work and workers will be and should be. If you aren't already on our mailing list and would like to hear about other events in our Making Work Work series, please sign up. You can do that either on our website or right outside at the table. Just a few obligatory thank yous. As always, the amazing members of the Wayne Morse Center team. Nothing is possible without them. Rebecca Dinwoody, Abby Stilley, Dan Titchener, Christine Waite, and Alex Farrington. Thank you also to our University of Oregon co-sponsor for this event, the Center for the Study of Women in Society, and also to the Department of Sociology for graciously hosting Sarita Gupta during the 4 weeks she is spending with us here in Oregon. We are also especially grateful to the many members of the Wayne Morse Circle who are here with us. Circle members provide crucial support for our programs through annual donations in any amount. If you aren't already a Circle member, please consider supporting our work by becoming one. More information is also available right outside and also on our website. And we look forward to bringing programs like this one with you for many, many years to come. Just a quick word about format today. It's very simple. Sarita Gupta will deliver her talk, and then there will be plenty of time for your questions and answers, and that's what this mic is for. It is a true pleasure and honor to introduce Sarita Gupta, the occupant of the 2021-22 Wayne Morse Chair of Law and Politics. Sarita is Vice President for U.S. Programs at the Ford Foundation. In 2019, Ford hired her to direct its program on the future of work and workers. She came to that job with more than 20 years of experience in organizing and policy advocacy aimed at expanding people's ability to come together to improve their workplaces, their communities, and their lives. She served for many years as the Executive Director of Jobs with Justice, a national leader in building the power of working people on the ground, online, and in the realms of public policy and research. She was also a co-founder and co-director of Caring Across Generations, which set out to change the way we think about, organize, and compensate caretaking labor in the United States, defining caretaking as essential infrastructure long before the COVID pandemic made it obvious to many of us that the entire economy rests on a foundation of paid and unpaid caretaking. Sarita has been a key player in too many campaigns to mention, but I'll mention 2 of them. The Asia Floor Wage Alliance is a global coalition of trade unions, workers' rights and human rights organizations dedicated to higher wages in the global garment industry. The United Workers Congress focuses on raising labor standards and protections for low-wage workers across industries. She is the recipient of the National Women's Law Center Annual Leadership Award, the Frances Perkins Open Door Award. And if you've taken one of my classes, you will know that Frances Perkins was the first female cabinet member, Secretary of Labor, during the New Deal. She won the Frances Perkins Open Door Award, a Mount Holyoke College Alumni Achievement Award, and a Corporate Ethics International Benny Award. On April 15th, just a couple of weeks from now, Sarita will publish a co-authored book with Erica Smiley titled The Future We Need, Organizing for a Better Democracy in the 21st Century. And we're going to have a celebration of that particular and wonderful event in a couple of weeks, so please come back for that. Sarita Gupta, in sum, is a nationally recognized expert on the economic, labor, and political issues affecting working people. She is widely acknowledged as a key leader and strategist in the progressive movement. Please join me in giving her a very warm welcome to Eugene and to the University of Oregon.
Well, thank you so much for that very warm introduction, Ellen. I appreciate that. And I really want to thank you for inviting me to chair this semester, this part of the inquiry. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you. And I really look forward to the next few weeks having the opportunity to learn and listen and offer what I can on this incredible inquiry about making work work. So as Ellen said, when I was invited, I was leading the Ford Foundation's Future of Work program. And let me just say a word about the Ford Foundation. We are a global social justice foundation, and our focus is on addressing the drivers of inequality. So not surprisingly, work is one of those realms. And actually, the program is called The Future of Workers and not Future of Work. And that was very intentional because we believe that in conversations about the future of work, too often we forget about the actual people who are doing the work that makes our economy function. Low and middle income workers who've experienced more than 40 years of stagnant or declining pay, shrinking benefits, and reduced power on the job. There was a frenzy a few years ago. Everyone and their cat was hosting future of work discussions. And the frenzy was about how robots were going to take over all of our jobs. Clearly, we're in a different moment right now. But even then, we understood that we had to center workers in the conversation about the future of work. As Ellen shared, I have been an organizer, campaigner, and advocate for workers' rights for over 20 years now. And it is true that in my former capacity at Jobs with Justice, my focus has been on protecting and expanding pathways for workers to have bargaining rights. In fact, towards the end of my tenure at Jobs with Justice, we began exploring the evolution of bargaining power as we know it, given the changing nature of our economy. And now at the Ford Foundation, I'm fortunate to work with a team that is focused on ensuring that all workers, regardless of their classification, have equal rights to labor protections, that social protections are guaranteed for all, and that workers shape the policies and the economic systems that affect their lives. We work to build public will and reimagine labor and social policies to make sure all work and workers are valued and protected. So not surprisingly, I was very drawn to working with the center given the theme of inquiry of making work work, which is something truly I have been thinking about for many, many years now, and look forward to sharing some initial thoughts with you today. When we think about the future of working people, it's really important that we think about the future, that their future is inextricably linked to our ability to promote and preserve equality and democracy. So 2 questions I want to explore in our conversation tonight is work working as it's currently formatted? And if not, how do we make work work? So I want to assert that work is not working for far too many people in this country. Before the pandemic and the economic recession hit, there were 64 million people who earned less than $15 an hour and could barely make ends meet, living paycheck to paycheck. Every day, they were making difficult choices, paying for rent, paying for food, paying for medicine, paying for diapers, whatever it be, but impossible choices. The pandemic and the economic crisis has laid bare the results of decades of growing inequality and compounded it, taking a disproportionate toll on the poor, people of color, immigrants, people with disabilities, and others who were already marginalized before the crisis. This pandemic has demonstrated the gross inadequacy of our existing social safety net and exposed inequities in access to basic needs for too many people, be it food or healthcare. And of course, during this pandemic, millions of people have died. And somehow we've lost that narrative in the story of the pandemic. But millions and millions of people have died and continue to die, many of whom are in fact workers. So, next week is April 4th, and April 4th is an important day in our history because it's a day that we commemorate Martin Luther King Jr., and that was the day he was killed. He was killed, and a lot of people forget this, while supporting sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee. At that time, Dr. King said, "Someday, our nation will realize that the sanitation worker is as essential as the physician, because all labor has dignity." Well, this, in fact, is what happened during the pandemic. The public took notice suddenly of essential workers. Essential workers, including the factory and agricultural workers, sanitation, delivery drivers, grocery store clerks, restaurant employees, and first responders, who have always kept society running and only were recognized as such during the pandemic, and in name only. Because these same working people do not have the basic protections or bargaining power in their companies and sectors to voice concerns about their working conditions. They want and deserve wages that would allow a decent standard of living. They want access to benefits, paid leave, and health care. Too many have been forced to work without access to childcare, and in too many cases, left to work without safe and healthy working conditions. So even as frontline essential workers were hailed as heroes, they have and continue to be treated as expendable. So today, we are witnessing what many have termed as the Great Resignation. While some call this moment the Great Resignation, millions of workers feel that America quit on them a long time ago. For the last 4 decades, we've experienced what I like to call the Great Stagnation of employers not meeting the needs of workers. A recent Pew Research report revealed that the wealth gap between America's richest and poorer families more than doubled from 1989 to 2016. That's not during a global health crisis. That's during so-called normal times. When the pandemic hit, that gap was electrified. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, in 2020, the lowest wage workers lost 8 million jobs, while the highest wage workers gained nearly 1 million jobs. So the Great Resignation is not about a great quit. This is a historic moment of refusal. People aren't quitting right now to leave the labor force. They're quitting to take other jobs, because workers don't want to accept anything less than living wages and benefits and safe working conditions. And we're in such an interesting cultural moment right now, right? Because workers across the economy are actually reflecting on and asking themselves, what is the purpose of work? What do I believe I want out of work? And, it's fascinating. I've had the great privilege of meeting with lots of workers and talking to them. And there's always an older generation of workers who will say to me, I remember a time when I used to work in order to live a full life. I worked so I could be involved in my PTA or in my church or my synagogue or in my civic association, my neighborhood association. Today, I feel like all I do is live to work. And fascinatingly enough, young workers are saying the same thing, not around what they remembered of work, but more about they're questioning what is the purpose of work, and can work actually be a vehicle by which they can do the many other things they want to do. So it's a really interesting cultural moment that people are asking themselves these questions, which creates lots of openings when we think about how we make work work. So millions of workers are leaving jobs and taking other ones because of ongoing health and safety concerns. That's the number one issue we hear. And because of COVID-related care responsibilities. It's important to remember that the lack of affordable and accessible childcare and school closures have contributed to this. The last set of numbers we saw were over 2.5 million women leaving the labor force because of the lack of a care infrastructure in this country. So while this is happening, workers leaving their jobs to find other ones, we're also seeing this incredible upsurge of workers taking collective action. Workers are organizing and forming unions right now. I mean, as we speak, workers in Bessemer, Alabama voted. Their votes are being counted right now. I'm attached to my phone to see when we are going to hear the results of that election. And of course, in recent months, Starbucks workers have gathered unprecedented momentum in unionizing efforts, following the flagship establishment of a union in Buffalo, New York, and then having branches across the country who are taking up the union fight. So far, at least as far as I understand, there are 6 or more branches here in Oregon that have announced union drives, which is really exciting. And here in Eugene. And of course, there are 600 digital workers at the New York Times who just unionized, because forever the writers and the journalists had unions, but the digital workers never did. So again, it's a really interesting time. We just see this upsurge of organizing. And of course, last fall was termed Striketober. There were workers in manufacturing, filmmaking, healthcare, and other parts of the economy that were going on strike. As of October 15th, over 100,000 workers were either on strike or preparing to go on strike. We had, John Deere workers, auto workers, over 10,000 workers who went on strike, or workers at Kellogg's, workers at IATSE in Hollywood, Nabisco workers, and of course healthcare workers and the Fight for 15, McDonald's workers. So actually what we're seeing right now is a great awakening. Workers are acting with their feet because work is just not working for far too many of them. So let's unpack this a little bit. How did we get here? Work as we know it is changing. It is being profoundly reshaped by the global pandemic. In addition to threats to public health, the economic and social disruptions threatens the long-term livelihoods and well-beings of millions. Yet well before the pandemic, shifts in work have been driven by forces such as globalization, demographic changes, technology, and climate change. So I just want to take a few seconds to talk about each. Globalization has helped accelerate a shift in how work is structured. In many advanced economies, the structure of work has shifted away from these mega firms of the past, which employed and provided benefits for large workforces across a range of skills and income levels. So think General Motors, for example, right? Or the Ford Company, right? Work is shifting towards more nimble firms who keep a light footprint when it comes to employment, offering permanent jobs to a relatively small number of high-end managers and engineers and other office staff, while relying on a fluid army of contingent workers for everything else. So think Uber or Instacart or many of the other companies like that. This trend towards what we call fissuring, it's a term that was coined by an academic and under the Obama administration, the wage and hour head of the wage and hour division, David Weil. Essentially, firms are constructing networks of subcontracting, outsourcing, and franchising that allow them to streamline operations and cut costs, specifically labor costs, by avoiding the responsibility once attached to the standard employment relationship of the past. And as a result of this trend, we see a rise in contingent work, so work that is much more precarious and insecure. And we see an increase in the independent contractor classification, which matters in a legal context because in U.S. labor law, they are excluded from collective bargaining rights since they're not employees. So what does this mean? This means millions of workers are excluded from basic labor standards. I'm going to say that again. Millions of workers are excluded from basic labor standards. And right now we face the threat of creating a whole new classification of gig workers who once again will be excluded from basic labor protections. So then you have demographic shifts. Around the world, we see expanding youth populations and aging populations in other parts of the world that are creating new pressures on labor markets and on social security systems. So here in the United States, we are in fact in the elder boom. People are turning 65 at a rapid rate in this country, and what that is resulting in is as people are turning 65 and older and setting towards retirement, they're living longer lives, which is a good thing and something we should celebrate. But what it has meant is it's put a pressure on our systems that were not created for such a large population of aging adults in this country. We don't have the kind of care system in place to truly support the ability for aging workers and aging people to age with dignity, right? And the result of that is a pressure on families. I myself, I am of the sandwich generation. I have a father who has Alzheimer's and a mother with severe mobility issues that I care for. I also have an 11-year-old daughter. And my husband and I literally feel like we're a panini, like we are squeezed between the needs of both ends of the spectrum, let alone our own health needs. Too many families are struggling right now to figure out how to support their care needs. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, over the next few years, over 50% of the workforce will be caring for aging adults in their lives. Over 50%, and we do not have the care structure in place to support workers in being able to provide that kind of support. This brings me to technology. While artificial intelligence, automation, and robotics will eliminate jobs, they are also poised to create new jobs. So the question is whether or not those new jobs will be good quality jobs that provide people with what they need to live sustainable lives. Job creation is truly critical for our economy. Yet often the discussion about job creation is framed as an either-or. Either we create more jobs or we create good quality jobs, but somehow we can't create both. Like we can't figure out how to make jobs better and create new ones. And so this moment is really, really critical for us to change that frame and to say it's a both and. We need good quality jobs that get created in our economy. More broadly across geographies and sectors, labor activities and classifications, technology is reshaping work in ways that meet the needs of businesses and consumers alike without concern for workers' interests. Just a little anecdote on this. My program at Ford funded for the first ever policy shop that is focused on technology and its impact on workers. Because believe it or not, every tech policy think tank was only framed towards consumer needs. That's deep. that is deep, that we haven't thought about how we protect workers in the midst of such incredible technological change. And that finally brings me to climate change. The greening of our economies as we adopt sustainable practices and clean technologies will also create huge opportunities for new jobs. So again, how do we make sure these are good quality jobs? And other jobs will disappear as countries scale back their carbon and resource-intensive industries. So again, this question comes up of how do we create the pathways for workers who will lose jobs to acquire new skills that match the jobs for tomorrow? So all of these forces have been at play, and they're exacerbated by trends that are making our economy increasingly unequal, such as wealth concentration among the super rich. In the U.S., the top 1% holds more of the country's wealth than the bottom 90%. We see incredible market concentration right now, including the heightened power of tech monopolies, which contributes to wage stagnation, limits entrepreneurship, increases the cost of living, and stifles innovation. Growing financialization of the global economy is the third trend that is playing out, which is designed to maximize the value for shareholders versus society at large. So consequently, work has become increasingly precarious, unsafe, and unsustainable for millions of people. And here in the U.S., we see wage stagnation. Wages have remained stagnant and in some cases declining. So just to translate that, people at the 40th percentile of the income distribution, so think bank tellers or think preschool teachers, they saw their incomes grow by just 0.3% per year from 1980 to 2018, while those in the top 0.1% saw their already large incomes quadruple over the same time. So to further illustrate this point, we just talked about essential workers, and one category of essential workers have been care workers, domestic workers. 30% of domestic workers in this country who make so much of work possible were found to rely on public assistance for food security. That's what we're talking about: wage stagnation and massive inequality. Workers have limited access to basic protections and benefits. In our country, where basic necessities such as health insurance and sick leave are tied to our work status, too many workers lack access to such basics. For instance, while 90% of professional workers have paid sick leave, only 27% of food service workers do. These are the people handling our food. They don't have paid sick leave. And of course, the pandemic showed us what this meant in terms of paid family medical leave. We are the only industrialized nation that does not provide paid family medical leave to our population. And of course, outdated labor laws and protections in this country. Labor laws have not kept pace with changes in the nature of work. For instance, gig workers, who are said to make up somewhere between 25 to 35% of the pre-pandemic workforce, are often classified as contractors, which prevents them from accessing basic benefits. They also face unpredictable schedules and variable pay. So gig workers have no access to these benefits, and this, of course, was a big debate, if you remember, when around economic recovery and some of the early acts that were legislation that was passed to support workers as soon as the crisis hit. There were fights to make sure gig workers were included in some of those protections. But for workers who can collectively bargain, the game is rigged against workers who want to try to form a union and collectively bargain. Pushes to unionize often fail because employers can deploy a range of extreme union-busting tactics and even break the law with very little repercussions. There's virtually no penalties for an employer who violates the law. You do not lose your license or your ability to bid for a government contract. You don't get any jail time, certainly. So if there's no repercussions, why would they not, in fact, deploy union busting tactics? Employers have a lot of capital, and according to the Economic Policy Institute, employers spend approximately $340 million on union busting annually. So I can go on about unions and union busting, but I'm going to keep us moving forward and just say that despite how hard it is for workers to form a union, most Americans support unions. A recent Gallup poll shows that 62% of people surveyed have a favorable opinion of unions. Yet the last 40 years has been really difficult for working people. I just shared a lot of stats with you. But I know this because I watched the impact of all of these dynamics on the community I grew up in. So a little bit about me. My family immigrated to the United States during a time when immigration doors were opened up for physicians because there was a physician shortage in this country for decades, especially in rural towns. This was about 10 years after Medicare and Medicaid was passed in 1965. So immigration doors were opened up to what were known as foreign medical graduates from around the world. So hence, we landed in Rochester, New York, otherwise known as Kodak City. Rochester is a mid-sized city in western New York. For those of you who don't know Rochester, it's situated on Lake Ontario and the Great Lakes bordering Canada. People in New York City call Rochester Canada, or they call us the Midwest. It's a long, it's a sore spot in my family. My husband's from Brooklyn. It's really bad. But we were one of the early Indian families in Rochester, and my parents were really active in the Indian community, helping to establish an ethnic association and then eventually helping to open an Indian community center. Looking back now, I realize that that's where I got my organizing roots from. We never called them organizers, but they were in fact building community and support systems. And so this was important because we were different. Where I grew up, I was one of the few kids of color in my school. In the 1980s, Kodak began downsizing due to aggressive competition and then their failure to adjust to shift to digital photography. I lived one town over from Kodak Park, which is what we call the industrial facility of Kodak. I lived in a working-class community where majority of the kids I grew up with had family members who had worked at Kodak for multiple generations. Most of my friends thought they would also end up at Kodak. Again, it's the largest employer, one of the largest employers in the area. They made decent money, they got benefits, and they were living a middle-class life. Let me be clear, Kodak did not have a union. George Eastman believed he could take care of workers. He was in fact that kind of an employer. So it's interesting learning the history of Kodak. In 1912, George Eastman, would introduce one of the most progressive and widespread profit-sharing programs in the history of corporate America. And then 7 years later, he offered employees nearly 1/3 of his personal stock at a price below the market rate. And then he used these proceeds to build and strengthen a welfare fund. And then Eastman later implemented paid sick leave, life insurance, disability coverage, a retirement annuity, paid college tuition, access to company-funded healthcare centers, and company housing. I share this because you can imagine when the company began laying off workers, there was very little that workers could do given they didn't have a union. And the first round of layoffs happened, I'm aging myself, when I was 8, in 1983. The company employment in Rochester, just to give you a sense, plummeted from more than 60,000 workers 40 years ago to 4,500 workers today. The impact was devastating. I had a really good friend whose family had worked at Kodak for over 3 generations, and her mom lost her job there and couldn't find comparable work. She ended up taking a job as a school bus driver, making significantly less money and having way less benefits. I watched as my family's friends struggled to maintain a middle-class lifestyle. I always asked myself, literally, I was 8 years old, and I was like, how is this possible? How can families who have worked for generations at a company lose their jobs and their sense of security like this? It just didn't feel fair, and it didn't feel right. My friend was really determined to go to college and get out of Rochester, where she saw limited options for her future. And in fact, she worked really hard and figured out how to get into college and work through college and was in fact able to leave. And I wish I could tell you that this is a typical story of the kids I grew up with, but it isn't. Some families left Rochester in search of work elsewhere. But the majority stayed and found work in smaller manufacturing plants, which over time certainly went into decline. Or they joined the ranks of growing low-wage service workers, living with less financial security and more precarity. Just to give you a sense, like manufacturing in Rochester and Buffalo, New York, and that part of the Rust Belt, if you will, it was really horrible in the 90s as manufacturing was declining. The Rochester area had 124,000 manufacturing jobs in 1990, compared with 60,000 in 2012. And in 2020, it was literally ranked one of the worst job markets in the country, according to the Wall Street Journal. For many of my friends and their families, they felt and continue to feel left behind. As the layoffs continued over many years, I was confronted with the complexity of race and class. On the one hand, I was a brown kid in a school, and people assumed that my situation must be even worse than theirs, right? In fact, it wasn't, but that was the assumption. And on the other hand, it became so clear to me how easy it was for them to scapegoat others. It was the fault of workers in other countries. Then it was the fault of immigrants and workers of color taking away jobs and opportunities. And these sentiments started then and remain in place as I read Facebook feeds of the kids I grew up with today. We see a lot of divisions in America today. Growing anger and frustration. People feel left behind by employers, by politicians, and in this case in Rochester, they missed out on having a union or an organization that could have advocated for their collective interests. Some of the kids I grew up with headed to D.C. on January 6th to protest the election and more, because they've lost faith in our democracy and the role of our government. They've bought into the narratives that people of color and immigrants are taking something away from them. Others have died or watched loved ones die of the opioid crisis. It is therefore not surprising that they feel a real lack of respect, dignity, and agency in their lives. This didn't just happen in Rochester, right? It happened in communities around the country. And there's endless stories that I've been hearing, especially of workers in the heartland, who talk about how betrayed they feel, how left behind they feel. And this speaks to why we not only need to make work, because we believe that all people should be able to work, live, and age with dignity, but why it's also important for people to have a voice and agency in all aspects of their lives, because this is what makes for a better democracy. There's an essayist, Yoni Applebaum, who has written about the demise of democracy and the concern that in the United States we've actually lost the daily habits of democracy. And I'll come back to that in a bit. But at the moment we are in now, there's an immense opportunity for us to forge a really different path forward. We can actually ask ourselves, how do we make work? The combination of the pandemic and the crisis and the trends and the cultural moment where people are asking themselves about work creates this opportunity. And over many years, I had the privilege to work with leaders and organizers in Jobs at Justice and with unions and worker centers to really learn about the different strategies and ways that we can forge ahead. And so as much as I shared this really sad story about the city I grew up in, I'm actually an incredibly hopeful person because I do think there's opportunities to make change, but we need to do it quickly. Because at the end of the day, whether it was workers at Verizon who were bargaining for a better contract, or it was workers at Smithfield or workers at Walmart organizing, or it was day laborers or domestic workers, all the campaigns I've been involved in, they all wanted the same thing: respect, dignity, and agency. And they wanted to be able to sustain themselves and their families and get a fair return on their work. So unions and emergent movements of workers outside of unions have been doing incredible organizing. And so that's what I want to share a little bit about now. And as Ellen said, I have a book coming out in 2 weeks. I have like the one copy of it. Yay! It's called The Future We Need, Organizing for a Better Democracy in the 21st Century. And my co-author and I will be able to do an event and we'll get to talk more. So I won't go into all the details of the book. But the book actually documents some of the examples that I want to share with you. And the premise of the book is that collective bargaining has to be expanded beyond workplaces to support a healthy political and economic multiracial democracy. The second is that, given all the changes I just talked about, it is critical that we modernize collective bargaining rights to meet the needs of modern workers. And thirdly, we have to confront white supremacy and patriarchy because they are central to our labor movement. They're not adjacent to it. They are central because workers have complex intersectional identities, and frankly, it's the only way we're going to win progress in this country. If my story about Rochester doesn't point out that if we could address the economic pain points and connect it back to a healthy democracy, there's so much we can achieve in this country. So let me talk a little bit and share a few examples of what I mean by modernizing collective bargaining rights, and this is how we make work work. We actually need to expand how we think about bargaining. We need to forge new ways of organizing and bargaining that really is appropriate to a world in which power is concentrating in the hands of fewer economic actors. At its best, collective bargaining is a system by which working people can exercise collective power in a way that directly confronts the owners of capital, right, and reclaims a portion of that capital for working people in their communities. Collective bargaining allows everyday people to practice democracy, directly engaging in the decisions that affect their lives. Collective bargaining affects our lives beyond work sites as well. Workers have a stake in the ability to come together collectively, not only as employees, but also in the myriad of other ways working people play a role in the economy. Tenants, debtors, homeowners, consumers, and many others have joined together to confront and negotiate with specific forces of capital, whether it's corporations, banks, student loan companies, and elements of the state to ensure dignified lives for themselves and their families. Therefore, we have to expand our definition of bargaining to be about creating pathways for working people to come together collectively to negotiate with any entity that has power over their lives, right? Employers, landlords, financiers, and much more. And in the context of workplace bargaining, we need to shift the very nature of what a union contract covers, broadening what individuals can negotiate over and who they can negotiate with, and really understand from their direct boss to the individuals with concentrated power in their sector or in their community. So let me unpack this a little bit, because today workers are confronting this question. Most workers don't actually know who their real bosses are. Let's be real. Most workers aren't sure what they're allowed to bargain over. And many workers have no experience of governing over other aspects of their lives. So we have a lot of work to do. So who is the real boss? The best example of this is McDonald's workers. So McDonald's workers go to franchises and they say, we want better wages, we want better working conditions, health and safety issues are important, et cetera. And the franchise owner says, well, I'm not the one who sets those standards. That gets done by headquarters. So then the workers go to the headquarters who say, well, we're not the ones who make that decision. The franchise owners do. And in that process, it's a shell game for workers, right? So what do we learn from that? We actually need to take the demands to the ultimate profiteer. We need to expand frameworks beyond employers themselves. So I'm going to share an example of this. For years, Driscoll's supplier, Sakuma Brothers berry growing operation in Washington State, employed immigrants and long-term residents from southern Mexico to pick berries and live in company-provided housing during the harvest season. The immigrants were largely indigenous people who spoke languages other than Spanish as their first language. And in 2013, berry pickers at Sakuma Brothers began protesting low pay and bad working conditions. When the company fired the leaders, many of the other workers began a strike against the company and eventually organized into Familias Unidas por la Justicia to bargain on their behalf. Sakuma Brothers retaliated by greatly expanding their request for H-2A guest worker visas. And at the same time, Sakuma told the people who had engaged in the strike against them that they were terminated, something they actually could do because farm workers were not covered by the National Labor Relations Act. However, workers unleashed an even bigger weapon against Sakuma. First, each of the workers, I love this, they wrote a letter to the U.S. Department of Labor refuting Sakuma's claim that it was unable to find workers in the U.S. by saying, hey, I'm willing to work there, right? Second, they organized a boycott against Driscoll's, who is the ultimate profiteer. The upside of not being covered by the National Labor Relations Act was that there was nothing to prevent them from organizing a secondary boycott of Driscoll's to win concessions from Sakuma. Because if you're covered under the National Labor Relations Act, you're not allowed to engage in secondary boycotts. So other unions respected the boycott against Driscoll's, including the Longshoremen's Union, which one day refused to load any Driscoll's berries onto ships. In addition, the union organized student protests and consumer boycotts of Driscoll's, which was another key step that they took, which is particularly important for workers today, especially in a global industry such as agriculture, was that the workers reached out to their counterparts in Mexico, their country of origin, to ask them to join in the action against Driscoll's. The workers in both countries set up a bi-national front to launch a strike and a boycott. All of this pressure brought Sakuma to the table. Despite the lack of any legal protections for the workers, Sakuma agreed to negotiate with the union in 2016, and in 2017 they agreed to collective bargaining agreement. There are other examples like this. Some of you may have followed the Coalition of Immokalee Workers and their Fair Food program, where they understood that the ultimate profiteer were the brands and that they needed to take the struggle to the brands. There's endless examples like that, but examples of workers finding more than one channel to negotiate with the decision makers. So another category is what we can bargain over. How do we embrace that bargaining can be a site of struggle? This is really important. Sometimes we think of collective bargaining as something that happens in a room between a group of workers and their employers. Yet bargaining can be a really powerful site of struggle, as we are seeing through the emergence of the Bargaining for the Common Good network. This is a network of unions and community-based organizations coming together, using traditional bargaining to raise issues broader than what is permissible under law in terms of topics to the table. The recent set of teacher strikes are great examples of this. In St. Paul, Minnesota, the teachers around their bargaining table said, we have a lot of immigrant students. We do not want immigration raids happening in the schools and in our community. And they won that in their agreement. Or Chicago Teachers Union, who together with the community fought and struggled. These were really public campaigns and won housing assistance for homeless students and families. These are issues that technically under the law are not the issues you can bargain over. But more and more workers are using their bargaining power to actually bring a broader set of issues in the community to the table. And that campaign is continuing across the country in the public sector and now beginning in the private sector with bank workers, actually, which is really fascinating. So then the third is who can bargain? So again, I might have skipped over this, so let me go back for a second. There are sets of workers who've been excluded from the National Labor Relations Act and the Fair Labor Standard Act. I talked about independent contractors, but way before that, when the New Deal was being negotiated and the National Labor Relations Act was being negotiated, there was a compromise between politicians in the South who represented the interest of plantation owners and politicians in the North. And the agreement was that they would exclude domestic workers and agricultural workers, all of whom at that time were Black, majority of whom were Black workers. And to this day, we live with that legacy of slavery, right? It's a legacy of slavery that is still with us today. These workers are still excluded from these basic protections. So the question is, what can they do? And who can bargain? If the law says they can't bargain, we just heard the example of farm workers figuring out a workaround. There's many more examples like that. So what we talk about in our book is what's called community-driven bargaining, applying frameworks of bargaining, because the labor movement has been the most successful in bargaining agreements that truly created pathways for people to be in the middle class, to make their way into the middle class, stay in the middle class. So why wouldn't we want to leverage that tool, that strategy, that ability? So how do we apply the frameworks of bargaining to other economic relationships? We have to start shifting the conversation on collective bargaining and talking about how to transform collective bargaining from the margins as a thing that unions do, which, by the way, is way less than 10% of our population today, right, to something that everyone seeks in all their economic relationships as a fundamental characteristic of democracy. This is important to make a connection between the person, the job, and their whole life, right? So there are many examples of how this is starting to take root. And I want to lift up the care sector for a moment and domestic workers. For a long time, as Ellen shared, I have been working and supporting home care workers. Unions, SEIU and AFSCME, who'd been organizing home care workers for many years, trying to create new strategies for bargaining. But I also had the opportunity to support domestic workers. These were largely home care workers. These are nannies. These are house cleaners and elder care providers who are hired by private households, right? So they're not employed through a big company or the state. They are literally employed by individuals. So the question was, how do you win rights for these workers? And I remember I talked about the aging population and the need for a care infrastructure. We don't have child care, et cetera. Well, what's been fascinating in the last few years is that the Caring Across Generations campaign really attempted to bring together care workers with families who needed care and individuals who needed care to say together, let's stop pitting workers' interests against families' interests or individuals' interests. Let's actually demand a different system where we can all get what we need. And so what's been so fascinating in crafting a campaign like that is when you embed workers' rights as part of a bigger common good strategy, It's so much easier to make progress. It's not easy, I didn't say, but easier to make progress. So under the Obama administration, we did in fact win the home care rule, where 2 million home care workers were afforded overtime and minimum wage protections. Again, these are workers that are not covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act. And since then, workers have continued to organize alongside recipients of care to together demand a whole new care system. And so the pandemic happens, and what happens? Suddenly, people are talking about a care economy. Let me tell you, as an organizer, when I first mentioned the language of care economy, people would laugh me out of a room. What's the care economy? Because it was invisible. People didn't want to talk about the invisible labor in our economy. Today, people are fighting for childcare. People are fighting for care infrastructure. But this didn't happen by accident. It did happen because of the great work of unions like SEIU and AFSCME, but it also happened because of the bold and innovative strategies of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. So in the last 10 years, the National Domestic Workers Alliance advocated and won basic protections and standards for house cleaners and care providers all over the country through bills of rights. They passed the first New York State Bill of Rights for domestic workers, and then it's kind of spread around the country, creating and setting standards. And when I say standards, I mean wage standards, days off, ability to have vacation, sick leave, etc. But more importantly, as they won these campaigns, they started to win what were called standards boards. So in Seattle, not far from here, in fact, the first domestic workers standard board was created. This standards board brought together domestic workers with industry leaders and the state to negotiate together on the standards for domestic workers. So why is this important? Because again, without this kind of an innovation of how you start setting standards and frankly start to amalgamate workers, it gets you on the path to what could be bargaining, right? And then most recently, NDWA launched their partner organization called NDWA Gig Worker Advocates to launch a first of its kind pilot program to advance workers' interests on a gig platform. So this organization was launched by the domestic workers movement to improve the quality of jobs for gig economy workers. Handy, which is an online marketplace for home cleaning, installation, and other home services, and the biggest online cleaning dispatcher, came together to create, it's the first time actually an advocacy organization and a gig economy company came together to negotiate an agreement. The pilot program extends to Handy Pros, which is what the workers are called, in the states of Florida, Kentucky, and Indiana, who book cleaning jobs on the Handy platform. What they won was $15 minimum base pay, substantive part-time off benefits, roughly the equivalent of 17 paid days off for someone who works 40 hours, which is obviously more than the minimum law, a contractual monthly process for Handy Pros and the company leaders to raise, discuss, and address problems that workers are experiencing on the platform. And they won this in states that, frankly, right now have very difficult legislative terrains, Florida, Indiana, and Kentucky, and where the labor movement has less political power than they once had. NDWA carefully architected this pilot so as not to disrupt or contradict other moving strategies in the gig economy, because many unions are trying to figure out how to negotiate. But they were able to be completely bold and innovative while being really conscientious and in solidarity with the rest of the labor movement. It's a victory for thousands of workers, nearly all women of color, who are denied even the minimal protections of traditional labor and employment law. So why is this? It's inspiring that we can have that. This is a group of workers who, again, under the law, don't have these rights, but have figured out how to innovate. And in that process, work with SEIU. Now, actually, SEIU and NDWA have a whole pilot program together where they're organizing home care workers together in some key states. The truth is, this is not a new strategy, because actually this is the strategy of the building trades, right? Building trades back in the day had hiring halls, created guilds, figured out how to amalgamate workers and bargain contracts and have prevailing wage standards set. It's exactly what domestic workers are doing, right? So there's so much. Sometimes we have to look back at history to remember that sometimes what didn't work 20 years ago could maybe work today given the changing conditions. And similarly, these kinds of standards boards I talked about with domestic workers are forming around the country, and wage boards are forming around the country. In fact, in Harris County, Texas, so near Houston, essential workers were able to come together in that county, and establish a standards board where they are negotiating with the state and with a set of employers around health and safety standards, minimum pay, and sick leave issues. So this is starting to take root, and this is what we need more of, right? Because here's the thing. Workers cannot wait for the laws to change. And laws don't change without workers being in struggle and in motion. And that's what's so exciting about this moment. And we see the burgeoning of sectoral bargaining ideas and frameworks that hopefully in discussion we can talk some about. But the point here is workers are in motion, and there's a huge opportunity for us to create real change. But we have to really shift how we think about our current laws and the idea of bargaining, which brings me back to democracy, because our movement must also tend to the fundamental work of revitalizing democracy, because working people cannot improve their lives without gaining an effective collective voice in shaping their work on and off the job. Democracy is more than political voice. It's got to be more than what we do once every 4 years, right? To vote. And we know there's enormous attacks on our democracy, enormous attacks on voting rights in this country. And there is a group of people who really believe in minority rule. They do not believe in democracy. It is imperative that we understand that democracy is not only about political democracy, but has to be about economic democracy as well. When we can forge economic and political democracy together, that is when we can overcome the stark polarity that we see in our country today and remind people of the daily habits of democracy and why it's important for us to be fighting for and preserving and strengthening our democracy as we know it. So in closing, I just want to say in this moment of great change, nothing is inevitable in what this means for the livelihoods and overall well-being for people and for workers. We are making choices every day. The choices we make as a people, as a nation, as industries will shape this moment and the experiences of workers and society for generations to come. We are facing many choices. We can decide that we're going to let others imagine a future that continues to benefit a handful of people, or we can imagine and act on a future that benefits us all for generations to come. There's a West African proverb that I had the privilege of spending time with some of the civil rights elders a few years ago. And one of the elders, he actually passed away, Vincent Harding. I asked him, oh my God, in these moments of crisis, how do you stay so grounded? Help me understand. How do you stay positive? How do you stay optimistic? And he said to me, he shared this West African proverb with me, which is, I am a citizen of a world not yet born, which really has to inspire us in this moment to embrace this moment of change. We really do have a blank canvas before us and an amazing history to build upon as a labor movement, as a civil rights movement, as the women's movement, as the worker movement. We are witnessing the beginnings of a new movement that's not yet fully formed, But it's up to us, right? All of us in this room and many others, to keep our eyes on the prize, to let our imaginations run wild right now, and to push beyond the existing structures and limitations, and really imagine a tomorrow and take the risks today to get us to the full democracy that we all deserve. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarita, for that very inspiring talk. And on your concluding theme that democracy is something to be taught and practiced on a daily basis, I'd like to welcome Parsa Agel, who's a member of the Wayne Morse Center's undergraduate program called the Wayne Morse Scholars, to ask the first question. After Parsa does that, you are all welcome to come up to the mic.
Hi there. Thank you for the talk. That was absolutely brilliant. I was particularly struck by your discussion of the Driscoll strike with immigrant workers. And through work with the SEIU, in fact, I've recognized that one of the groups that lacks the labor power to engage in collective bargaining or strikes are undocumented workers, particularly because their status of migration is held over them, their lack of citizenship. And when this is intersected with the fact that you also mentioned that a lot of white workers feel abandoned by the nation and feel that immigrant workers have stolen their opportunity in this nation, I was wondering, because you discussed the Great Awakening, where a lot of the exercise of labor power actually looks like leaving the workforce, for migrant workers and undocumented workers who don't have that opportunity, what does it look like to not leave them behind in this process of exercising labor power to move forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that question. And in fact, I will say that undocumented workers are some of the most bold and innovative strategists right now as we speak. So all these examples, domestic workers I shared, the farm worker example I gave, many more. I want to be clear that undocumented workers have been in the forefront of many of those campaigns. And part of what we have to remember, I remember when I was organizing in Chicago was when there was this incredible upsurge of immigrant worker organizing happening. It was janitors organizing and hotel workers and industrial laundries and food processing plants. And workers didn't know if they had the right to organize and collectively bargain. And so we had to really start from a place of reminding people that actually immigrant workers do have the right to organize and collectively bargain. And actually unions, it took a while for unions to really understand both immigration law and employment law and labor law, and to figure out how you craft strategies that protect workers as much as possible. So it is true that undocumented workers are very much at risk because of the way that immigration can be held over their heads. But what we've seen in endless campaigns is when undocumented workers are standing together with workers that are citizens of the U.S. or are green card holders, they are in fact able to maintain the ability to continue to fight for the dignity and respect that they're fighting for. And, I think about undocumented workers. There's a case that I worked on with CJ seafood workers. They were in Louisiana, and these workers were in deplorable conditions, and they were seasonal workers, and many of them were undocumented, and the company knew it, and so they abused them and exploited them even more. And the workers managed to get in touch with the National Guest Workers Alliance, and we forged a big public campaign. And in that public campaign, we ended up getting the New York Times to do an expose of this company. And this goes back to the ultimate profiteer. We knew CJ Seafoods was not going to change their behavior because they're part of a supply chain. But we knew if we put the pressure on Walmart, we could change the conditions. And in fact, in the New York Times, they did an expose of Walmart, and Walmart came to the table with the CJ seafood workers and figured out how to negotiate a different contract and set a different standard on their supply chains. So my point here is that none of what I talked about is exclusionary of undocumented workers. And in fact, in many workplaces, they are in fact some of the key leaders. But the question of how we create solidarity and craft smart public campaigns that don't allow the company, the employer, to use immigration status over their heads, because that's easy to do when they're locked away in a factory or in a room. But when it's out in the public, it's harder to do, and there's way more opportunities to find recourse. And so I'm grateful for many of the undocumented workers in this country, and I think we often forget that because of their leadership, many of the rest of us benefit, actually, as a result. Thank you for your question.
I've heard there is a second question from one of our Wayne Morse scholars, Jacob Hollenbach. Please come on right up.
Jacob was the best. He was like nodding throughout my talk. I was like, okay, I'm saying something right here.
It was an awesome talk. I really appreciate it. A string of recent Supreme Court decisions that have been very anti-labor, like the landmark Janus decision, have earned the Roberts Court a comparison to the Lochner era. What role, if any, do you see court reform playing in making work as it did during the New Deal era?
Such a great question, and so complex, because I'm not very hopeful about the Supreme Court right now. And even with the new appointment, it doesn't change the ratio of those who support workers' rights and bargaining rights on the court. So I think we have to continue, as unions have been doing, to really fight the good fight in the courts, especially as you talked about the Janus strategy and others. But this goes back to why it is really critical that we understand the courts are not going to save working people in this country, and neither will the laws without working people actually taking collective action and organizing for a different future. And I can't stress that enough. Nothing is going to change in the courts until we put the kind of pressure in the streets, and the kind of strikes and organizing that we see happening right now are really, really critical, because we have to change the public conversation. For too long, the public narrative around workers and unions, as we know, after 40 years of a union-busting industry, people have, as much as the Gallup says there's like positive orientation towards unions, people still hold a lot of reservation about unions and the idea of worker voice, right? We have to fundamentally change our culture. So yes, we have to change the laws, and we can have the best ideas on how to do that. We can change the court, and we can try our best. And I do think unions and the worker movement, progressive movement, have to think about a court strategy. And none of that will matter if we don't fundamentally change the narrative and the culture around this idea of people being able to actually govern over aspects of their lives. So for me, the key strategy is there. It's not in the courts. That's not to say they don't have a role, but I don't think that's where we're going to make the great leaps forward, because I do think we're in a moment of not incremental change. We are actually in a moment, and this only happens once in a generation, of great leaps. And the leap is not going to happen through those strategies.
Thank you.
Sure. Other questions or thoughts, please?
So I appreciated your history of Rochester, and grew up with Kodak, and I've been to Rochester. And I got to thinking, what could have the workers done? Corporation failed. It wasn't going to survive. It wasn't going to keep up. They couldn't take charge, or maybe they could, of designing digital projects, but what could they have done in that situation?
Yeah. No, it's such a great question. So first off, one thing I learned as I was diving in, I was 8 years old when the layoffs started, and the story and my experience throughout my childhood of Kodak really has stayed with me. And so a few years ago, I really went back into history books and tried to learn more about the company. And many business schools have written case studies about Kodak. And one thing that I learned is they had a really hard time shifting to digital photography and the digital technology. Yet workers at Kodak had actually come up with the first sort of model of digital photography. What would have happened if those workers actually had a voice at that moment when the company was scared to take a risk? And the workers could say, actually, we really think this is the way to go. What a different outcome we could have had, right? So that's one element that I think about often. The other is knowing there was this demise. The fact that there was nothing set up in terms of the ways in which workers could shape and talk about the economy that they wanted in Rochester was really deep. When now there's healthcare sector, there's some small manufacturing that's starting to come back into the Rochester area. But really, the quality of the existing jobs, the push for, even if there were only low-wage service sector jobs, how workers could have organized to make those better quality jobs and to push for better wages, to say, I'm not going to accept that I used to make $60 an hour and now you're telling me I have to make the federal minimum wage, right? It reminds me a lot of in Michigan, outside of Detroit. I had the privilege of meeting with some workers who said to me, no one is solving my problem. I used to make $40, $50 an hour, and the best the progressive movement can come up with is the fight for 15 and the minimum wage. I don't want a $15 job. Right? Now, that is not to undermine or undercut the fight for 15, because the truth is those workers have been making nothing, right? Exactly. Or if you're a tipped worker, you've only been making $2.13 an hour, right? So the question is, how can we raise and lift everyone up, right? And so I think the fact that workers in that case didn't actually have the practice of collectively coming together and demanding change, to actually have workers who run for office in Rochester, to set different policies forward, none of that muscle was there. Now, it's not like there weren't any unions in Rochester, but they were never strong enough to do what we're talking about. And meanwhile, we see in other cities and other communities, when workers have a union, they are very active civically in their communities, including workers running for office, right? And changing laws and policies. But I feel like I just never saw that. And what would that have looked like if there was not a union? Ideally there was a union, but if there wasn't a union, if more civic associations were able to come together more collectively. And Rochester has an incredible history of community organizing, by the way. So it's not like there was no organizing happening, but something wasn't in the water. It didn't bring people together in the way that one would think. A lot of the community organizing was happening in downtown Rochester, mostly in the Black community. And there was it's such a racially segregated city and community. So the idea that Black workers and white workers at Kodak could come together, and then of course there were all these foreign workers who were at Kodak, could come together to collectively find some shared interest, that weaving just never happened. But I think that is actually what we need more of today. We have to break out of our, the communities we're already in, and push ourselves to be building with and engaging with and conversing with communities that look nothing like us, and begin these conversations about what we share in terms of values. And that's how I reconcile, I just imagine what could have been possible right? And that's the question we have to ask ourselves all the time. Like, what is possible? You know, if we could just imagine a different future. One last thing, and we should go to another question. Did you all see the movie? Oh my God, I'm forgetting the name now. This always happens to me. The movie about the NASA, the African American women. What was it? Hidden Figures. Thank you. So some of you have seen Hidden Figures, and you watch it and you're just like, oh my God, but thank God for these women who made this all possible, right? My God, take a second. And I had this moment like, what would have been possible if those women actually had rights in place and protections in place? What could have been accomplished and what more can be accomplished? And that's the question we have to ask ourselves is what is possible if ... If we actually gave people the agency and the respect and the dignity they needed, we can trust in our humanity that good things can happen. And that's what we have to go back to, is that belief that actually if we just trusted people and treated people with the kind of fairness and equity they're asking for and voice, so much more is possible in our country today and, frankly, around the world. There's a question over there and there. Yeah, whoever wants to go.
So I'd like to follow up with a question about legislative solutions.
Yeah.
So what changes would you lobby for to update the National Labor Relations Act?
Okay, well, great question. One, I would get rid of this idea that we can't do secondary boycotts. That's crazy. I mean, we gave up power on the table. I would give up this idea that we can't strike, the right to strike. That is insane. How in the world, that is the number one form of power that workers have in this country. And it was all compromised away. Now, why was it compromised away is also important. The NLRA is actually rooted in commerce. It was all about keeping labor peace, right? It was not rooted in our Constitution and our human rights framework, right? So when you think about the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, these are all amendments that were like the end of indentured servitude and slavery, the right to vote, the right to citizenship. The National Labor Relations Act was not grounded in those frameworks of human rights. They were grounded in commerce. So what I would change is actually fundamentally shift that. That actually labor law needs to be grounded in our Constitution. It needs to be grounded and connected to a human rights framework. And that is critical to happen. There's many more minutia things like arbitration, and there's a million different other things I would change in the law, but those are the big pieces that I think would absolutely make a huge difference today in workers' ability to win the kinds of protections and voice they need. There is one other question here.
So as a student at a institution of higher education, it wasn't until recently that I actually became involved with labor organizing, both on campus and in Eugene more broadly. And I think it's really easy as academics and as higher education students to study and report and write about labor organizing. But my question is really with the goal of a labor movement that's spearheaded by the actual workers who are living that experience day to day. What in your experience can academics and students, particularly at institutions of higher education, do to actually further and contribute to that kind of work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a lot of things that students and academics can do. One is there's just been such immense organizing happening on campuses, workers who are organizing, whether they're graduate students, contingent faculty who are organizing. I know University of Oregon is pretty unionized, so speaking to the choir in that sense. But I think around the country, academics and students can play a big role in supporting workers who are in fact organizing on campuses. I think the second thing is, when I was at Jobs of Justice, there were often campaigns where we needed academics to validate and affirm a situation. So an example of this is when I was in Chicago organizing with Jobs of Justice, the Coalition for the Homeless had come to us and said, something is going on, like we're getting reports that shelters and food pantries can't keep up with the homeless population, yet we think people are working. And so we organized a whole brigade to go out and basically interview homeless men and women in shelters, and learned through that process, thanks to a set of academics who worked with us to create a participatory research project. We learned that at that time, this is in 1998, over 100,000 Chicagoans worked day labor. And as a result, we actually formed the first day labor center. It was the first worker center in the city of Chicago, and won a whole set of standards and changes over time. But academics played a big role, not only because they provided the way to actually research and help us understand what was happening with the temp agency in Chicago and the workforce, but also when we were ready to move policies, they played an important role. We used to organize these workers' rights board hearings where we would bring academics and policymakers and journalists and others together to hear the stories of workers. It was really important for academics in that case to be part of delegations with workers. So there's a lot of different ways that I think academics can play a really critical role in affirming, or when workers actually do things like card check, like to walk in with the workers and be a public figure that is documenting what is happening. The third thing I'll say, as students, and this is a question of whether faculty members want to engage in this, but when I started organizing, I came out of the student movement. And actually, I was telling Ellen that the last time I was at the University of Oregon, I was a student leader at the U.S. Student Association. We were running a referenda on this campus, so I got to know the campus really well. But the reason I raised that is because one of the things that drove me into the labor movement was when I understood that there were attacks on student democracy. The attacks on student fee autonomy on campuses were equivalent to the attacks on bargaining rights, that there were attacks on our democracy. And in fact, back then, I had no idea. It was the beginning stages of attacks on student fee autonomy in places like Wisconsin. But today, the student movement and the student associations are completely decimated. Decimated. Most students don't even think of, can they govern over their campuses? Student government has no meaning for people anymore. But at one time, there was a vibrant student movement in this country that actually created a lot of change. So I think there are sets of students today that are really trying to turn the tide on that. And the role that academics and students can play in supporting the importance of a resurgence of democracy on campuses, I think is really important. This goes back to the daily habits of democracy. You shouldn't only be practicing democracy if you're lucky enough to have a union, right? Like, there's ways to do that. And so those would be some of the ways I think academics and students could make a difference today towards this bigger project around strengthening and preserving and protecting our democracy, let alone our voice in all of this. I know he was trying to get in.
I'm afraid our time with Sarita Gupta right now is up. Thank you to all the questioners. If you're interested in hearing more from Sarita and more about the issues related to making work work, please come back for more of our events. You can check our website for dates and times and Zoom links and so on. Thank you all so much for coming, and thanks again to Sarita Gupta for a wonderful